Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of, I've got a blank here, you can tell us, Chris, is it 9, 10, 11, widely read, left books, veteran New York Times war correspondent turned war, anti-war activist. Chris has been arrested for civil disobedience against imperialism, against racism, against police statism, against ecocide, against capitalism. He sued the Obama administration in 2012, briefly winning a federal injunction against indefinite detention. Nobody up here was remotely fooled by Obama. Nobody up on this panel fell in love with Bernie Sanders. One of us up here even labeled Bernie Sanders a sheepdog, if I remember correctly. These guys don't mess around. I get to go first because this panel was my idea. In my opening comments, I'm going to stick mainly to the first provocation. There were recruitment attempts in that regard. There truly were, trust me. And we had a lot of scheduling issues that got in the way of that happening. I'm going to stick to this first provocation, to an assessment of the actually existing so-called left. I have my own ideas on what is to be done. I'm going to hold off on those until the end, maybe even till the Q&A. I don't want it to go on too long before we get to Glen, Bruce, and Chris. In 1848, Marx Engels wrote that the class struggle between producers and appropriators always ends either in a revolutionary transformation of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Folks, common ruin is precisely where we are headed 170 years later as capital turns the planet into a giant greenhouse gas chamber. Crime, by the way, that will make the Nazis look like small-time thugs by comparison. The rich, Hervé Kempf pointed out a decade ago, are destroying the earth. Well, not the earth itself, just all chances for a decent, organized human future. The bourgeoisie, if I might use a forgotten term, isn't doing this because it's loaded with ecological Scrooges who need to be visited by the ghosts of environmental Christmas past, present, and future. Capitalists are driven to pillage, poison the commons by systemic imperatives, compelling them to commodify everything under the sun, to maniacally push infinite growth, permanent accumulation on a finite planet. For any authentic left today, as for Marx in his time, the moral predisposition of bourgeois elites is of little concern. It's not about speaking truth to wealth and power. There's no appealing to capitalist better angels where money and profit are concerned. We're not trying to act out a Charles Dickens novel where Mr. Brownlow saves the day for young waif Oliver Twist, or where the mean capitalist Scrooge becomes the nice benevolent capitalist Scrooge. Real leftists know that 5 absurdly rich people holding the same net worth between them as the bottom half of the species is capitalism working. That's the system working. The top 10th of the upper 1% possessing as much wealth as the nation's bottom 90%, owning most of the nation's politicians and policymakers along with the media, most of the educational apparatus. Folks, that's the system working. Returning to its 500-year inegalitarian plutocratic norm. We know that giant corporations buying up nearly every last family farm, tapping every new reserve of cheap global labor, stealing the Congo's precious raw materials, crafting so-called public policy in their own private interest, extracting, burning every last fossil fuel. We know that's capitalist working. The military-industrial complex generating profits for so-called defense firms and concocting pretexts for endless imperial intervention while our schools and parks and infrastructure and social safety nets are underfunded. That, people, too, is capitalism working. I could go on and on in this vein. The only solution a real left would know, along with Marx, who, by the way, turned 200 on May 5th of this year. It's amazing, 200 years and still kicking. I know Chomsky's almost 90, but I mean 200, please. The only solution a real left along with Marx knows, is for workers and citizens to organize collectively to overthrow the profit system, to take control of what they produce, how they produce it, how society is organized. Power to the people, power to the workers, and power to the commons, whose enclosure was and remains the making of the modern wage-enslaved working class, also the making of modern slavery, and the making of modern mass incarceration, curiously enough. This is what I've always understood to be the basic, irreducible, bottom line perspective of anything since the time of Karl Marx, Frederick Douglass, and Bakunin to be the left. I'm always amused when I hear some reporter, some talking head, politician, pundit refer to, quote, the left. The left, as in the left won't like Trump's tax plan, or the left is gearing up for the 2018 midterms, the left this, the left that, all day long. You know, you should hear the stuff at my family gatherings from my in-laws about the so-called super out-of-control radical left. You know, people like Nancy Pelosi and Charles Schumer. All those hardcore workers' control advocates. What big, powerful left are they talking about? And by the way, where do I join? In the dominant reigning media politics culture, it refers primarily to the Democratic Party, but for anyone who knows anything about the actual history of radical movements, calling the dismal, demobilizing, dollar-drenched Democrats the left is like calling the National Pork Producers Association a vegan lobbying organization. As the multimillionaire House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi told a young Bernie fan during a CNN town hall last year, "We're capitalists, and that's just the way it is." Presidential candidate Barack Obama gushed praise for the lords of capital and their glorious profit system, which he called a source of a prosperity that's unmatched in history. As president, his Goldman Sachs Citigroup vetted policy hands did more for the nation's leading financial institutions and corporations than any republic could ever dream of having done. And Obama was actually proud of this, boasted about it. He's been cashing in on it ever since. Many progressives call for the Dems to abandon their corporate and cultural elitism and return to its purported grand mission of, fighting for social justice and ensuring the workers get a fair deal, like back in the days of Franklin Roosevelt. When will the Democrats learn how to win? But it isn't about winning for the DDDs, the dismal dollar-drenched Dems. It's about serving corporate masters, as William Kaufman told Barbara Ehrenreich, believe it or not, on Facebook, but I noticed it and I saved it. It was just by chance. I was going through the feed. As he told her last year, Democrats aren't feckless, inept, stupid, unable to learn what it takes to win. They're corrupt. They don't want to win with an authentically progressive program because it would threaten the interest of their corporate donor base. The Democrats are full-grown adults. They know exactly what they're doing. They have a business model subserving the interest of the financial elite. So what if Bernie Sanders probably would have prevailed, or very possibly would have prevailed over Trump in 2016? The reigning corporate Dems would rather lose to the right, even to a proto-fascistic white nationalist eco-exterminist white, than lose to the left, even to a mildly progressive social democratic left within their own party. Russiagate, among other things, is the inauthentic opposition, as Sheldon Wolin called the Democrats, following its business model, doing its job, working to cover its tracks, and to throw the debacle of its neoliberal corporatist politics down Orwell's memory hole. Russiagate is meant to provide corporate Democrats cover, not only for 2016, but also for 2018 and 2020. It advances a narrative that lets Dems continue nominating business-friendly neoliberal shills and imperialists who pretend to be progressive while they are owned by the nation's unelected dictatorships of money and empire. This year's crop of congressional candidates is loaded with military and intelligence veterans, including in the district in Bloomfield where I'm staying during the left forum, where the politicos are all meeting me and canvassing me on behalf of some woman who's running for Congress. And what's her great selling point? 10 years in the military. This is a reflection of the Democrats' determination to run as the true party of empire. Not that Bernie was all that left. Bernie F-35 Sanders' occasional carefully hedged claims to be a democratic socialist were contradicted, I at least thought, in Iowa by his quiescence on the American empire. You know, it takes real chutzpah to trumpet Scandinavia as your social democratic role model without noting once that Sweden, Denmark, and Norway pay tiny percentages of their budgets on militarism. And failure to tackle the war budget, as Dr. King pointed out in 1967, means you can't pay for poverty-ending progressive transformation at home. Sanders has never seriously criticized modern class rule, deeply understood, and along the way he helped sustain, I think, progressives' deadly attachment to the nation's time-staggered, narrow, election candidate-centered politics. Howard Zinn used to say that the really critical thing isn't who's sitting in the White House, it's who's sitting in the streets, in the cafeterias, in the halls of government, and in the factories. And I'm afraid Bernie was and remains very much about the master's election cycle, which is dedicated to the delusional notion that we, the people, get meaningful input into policy by spending 3 minutes in a voting booth once every 2 or 4 years, choosing from among a handful of candidates selected in advance for us by the nation's unelected financial dictatorship. Democrats know that lots of citizens and activists think like Zinn. That's why they set up AstroTurf outfits like Indivisible, Move On, Town Hall Project, fake resistance groups masquerading as extra-electoral grassroots movements, but whose real purpose is to channel everything into a big get-out-the-vote campaign for candidates affiliated with the not-so-leftmost of the two reigning corporate parties. Now, a number of Sanders supporters have migrated into DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. A lot of good people that I know are doing that. I looked at its online video, Thanks Capitalism, which seems to define socialism as little more than collective bargaining agreements and civil rights. The video says nothing about capitalism's destruction of livable ecology or about its evil twin, imperialism. There's a panoply of sometimes progressive, substantively progressive advocacy, policy, and service organizations that can be found across the country. They tend to be crippled by single issuism relating to their silo-inducing dependence on private foundations. There are many multi-issue, nonpartisan, progressive policy, lobbying, protest groups in the citizen action tradition across the country. Their 501c3 status prevents them from overtly identifying as Democratic Party affiliated groups. But that's pretty much what they are. Authentic radicals who want to keep their jobs know to tread carefully and watch their backs when they work in the progressive nonprofits sector. I have all kinds of stories about that. It's the same in higher education and the so-called labor movement. We've seen hopeful seeds and moments, and I participated in many of them, of people's organizing over the years, briefly inspiring developments like the Wisconsin Rebellion, Occupy, Fight for 15, the Chicago subsequent statewide teacher strikes, Verizon strike, the movement against racist police killings, which is a movement bigger than just the Ford Foundation funded and Borley Alice Foundation coordinated Black Lives Matter. There's been the Malcolm X grassroots movement, We Charge Genocide, Standing Rock, the broader struggle that I was part of in Iowa against the Dakota Access Pipeline, the successful campaign against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I think the remarkable alternative economy developments led by black leftists in Jackson, Mississippi. Which to me is one of the most really remarkable and hopeful developments going on right now. Now we have the Poor People's Campaign just under the way, under the leadership of Reverend William Barber. I know other panelists are going to talk about the PPC, and I'm going to leave any comments I have on that till later. I will say this, though. In his final years, Dr. King, leader of the original Poor People's Campaign, became less and less reluctant to name the disease that was causing poverty as capitalism. He acknowledged that he was fighting what he called a class struggle. The real issue, Dr. King, who's been sanitized in the official American Orwellian historical memory and who in fact was a democratic socialist, the real issue to be faced, King wrote in his very last essay, posthumously published, is the radical reconstruction of society itself. For now, and this must change, the U.S. left is too scattered, excessively siloed, overly dependent on corporate foundations, excessively episodic, excessively metropolitan and bicoastal, excessively professional and middle class, insufficiently working class, insufficiently anti-capitalist, and insufficiently distanced from the Democratic Party, and excessively, I think, identity politicized. I'm not against identity as part of our political practice, but there's a left way of handling identity, and there's a neoliberal bourgeois way of handling identity. Now, I will say this, in some hyper-identity politicized so-called left circles now, you are damn near suspected of being a racist or a sexist and or a homophobe for using the phrase working class. Or for preferring the time-tested, easily understood word solidarity over the somewhat confusing academic term intersectionality. Some so-called left folks will look at you like you're a demented Stalinist dinosaur if you dare to observe that not every single last white American in the country is super privileged simply because of the color of their skin. I get resistance from so-called lefties in campus town America when I suggest spending less time shaming white working class people for their color privilege and more time on appealing to their basic economic class interest in forming solidarity with their fellow workers of different races and ethnicities. There's nothing wrong with appealing to self-interest and economic class interest. In the campaign against the Dakota Access Pipeline in Iowa, I was taken aback by how many activists seemed coldly disdainful to the question of how can we find jobs for people employed in the fossil fuels sector after we move to alternative energy. I get it. There's no jobs on a dead planet. But why not tell working people and unions that, as economist Robert Pollin has found, clean energy generates more jobs for a given amount of investment than does maintaining a country's existing fossil fuels infrastructure. And I am wrapping up here. The absence of a serious, sustained left is dangerous as hell. I think much more than many people understand. People who are getting shafted and who know it are going to get behind militant politicos seeking to channel their understandable rage. If there's no effective, durable, through thick and thin, organized, intelligent, anti-capitalist left around, the job of working with that popular anger falls by default to xenophobic, white nationalist, neo-fascist, reactionary populists, to the Marine Le Pens, the Geert Wilders, the Matteo Salvinis, the Nigel Farages, the Norbert Hofers, the Sebastian Kurzes, the Alexander Golans, the David Dukes, the Steve Kings, the Jeff Sessions, the Donald Trumps, and the Steve Bannons of the world, because resentment abhors a vacuum. Without a functioning left ready to fight, do real things for everyday people, we will have no way to defend and sustain our households, our families, and communities when the next big capitalist meltdown comes, an event that is overdue and coming in the very near future. Meanwhile, with or without a financial crisis, capitalogenic, I try to get people to move off of anthropogenic and say capitalogenic environmental catastrophe looms closer with every passing year as talking heads obsess over this week in Trump and Russia. We are racing to the fatal mark of 500 carbon parts per million per atmospheric million by 2050, if not sooner. The greenhouse effect is not rocket science. The planless, chaotic, growth-addicted profits system has brought us literally, to quote Chris Hedges, to the cusp of extinction if we don't get off the march to ecocide. Nothing else that we care about on the left is going to matter all that much. We're just going to be arguing about the more equitable sharing out and distribution of the pieces of a poisoned pie. We're going to be turning the world upside down, but unfortunately it's going to be a hopelessly poisoned world. That's historical materialism 101. It's socialism or barbarism if we're lucky. It's eco-socialism or annihilation sooner than many of us dare to acknowledge. If there's no future for a radical mass movement in our time, Istvan Massaros wrote 16 years ago, there can be no future for humanity ourselves. We have our work cut out for ourselves. Power to the people, power to the workers, power to the commons. Thank you very much. Glen is going to talk right now, and we're coming up to here, if that's okay, Glen. You want to stay there? Can he do that?
It'd work better if he went to the podium.
They say it's going to work better.
Power to the people.
Power to the people.
I'm very proud and honored to be among those that Paul Street has allowed to think with him about what an authentic left would look like in the United States. It's something that many of us are thinking about all the time. I think that this authentic left initially would look exactly like it does now, because you have to start from where you are. But it would begin to start talking and behaving quite differently. I think what we are really talking about is how do we make a movement, a ruling class destroying movement in the United States. That's a simple proposition, and I think certain things flow from that proposition. Of course, we would be talking about setting in motion several mass-based movements that are linked in their shared enemy, the ruling class and its organs of coercion and control, the organs that people come up against every time they move, and even if they don't move. And these mechanisms of coercion and control are more than just the police and the mass incarceration gulag. They are more than just those police and jails plus the vast national security state. It is also the corporate media, which in the last 2 years, certainly, we have witnessed, we have learned how they work hand in glove with the U.S. domestic and international spy agencies. That is obviously what is going down with this Russiagate hysteria. The unity of the oligarchy and the corporate media and the national security state is perfectly personified in the person of Jeff Bezos, the Amazon owner, and also owner of the Washington Post, whose company has a $600 million contract with the CIA. Bezos is the richest man in the world. He and two other oligarchs, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, own more wealth than the entire poorest half of the American population. And that is the kind of oligarchic fact that is becoming commonly known out there in this vast 300 million person country, that these three people have more money than all of half of them. These are monopolists. They are the masters of what they themselves call creative destruction, which is a very grotesque way of them bragging about the huge disruptions that hyperactive capital is causing in U.S. society, and of course much greater destruction in the global South. The concentration of capital in the U.S. and the global capitalist world has reached such a point that the individuals at the top of the oligarchy, the men and the few white women who are named Walton, can be counted on our fingers. We know most of their names, and much of the public knows most of their names. That is the state of concentration that we have reached. The heads of the big banks that are the queen ants of finance capital, and finance capital is the enemy of all mankind. Those banks, and some of the heads of those banks, but those banks can be listed, counted on the fingers of one hand. The crisis of late-stage capitalism is all around us, and the people know that the overlapping crises are in motion. They see it all around them. Even those who still have good jobs see the crisis in motion. They talk about it, even if it has not devastated them personally yet. There is fear everywhere in the United States, even among those classes of people who on paper seem to be looking good, especially if they are two good job households. The people also know the names of the oligarchs at the top of the list, many of those names. Most importantly, everybody knows that the banks are criminals, and everybody hates the banks. And that is not a hyperbolic statement. I'll say it again. Everybody, or virtually everybody, hates the banks. The only hatred that rivals in the United States, the only hatred that rivals the hatred of the banks, is the hatred and fear of black people and Muslims and Latino immigrants in U.S. society. But the second biggest hatred is the hatred of the banks, and that's the one we got to work on. And in fact, hatred of the banks is damn near universal in that it is pervasive among all groups in this society, including even many upper-income whites. Right-wing libertarian Republicans who actually do have representation in Congress hate the bankers who occupy an especially evil place in their worldview. I don't pretend to understand their worldview in its intricacies, but in that worldview, they hate the bankers. And I suspect that anti-Semitism has something to do with that, since they think that these evil bankers are almost entirely Jewish. But they do hate the banks. And that is what is most important today. They think, anyway, the hatred of bankers is everywhere in the country. So if that is the case, and it is, how much imagination does it take to imagine a new 21st century U.S. left? A real left wants to overthrow the ruling class, which is centered, of course, in finance capital. The people, in their multi-splendored, multi-culti magnificence, hate the banks. Therefore, a real left mass movement for the 21st century must call for nationalization of the banks. That is the logic of history. Now, I said nationalize. That means state takeover. It does not mean a temporary takeover, but a permanent takeover of the banks. We're not talking about just cleaning the crooks out and then giving the banks back to the finance capitalist class, as if there aren't crooks ready to come right back and do the same thing. We're talking about dethroning the bankers. That is, we are making what is in fact a revolutionary demand, but one that I am confident is actually a popular demand. In fact, as I said, I think there is no more popular demand than smashing the power of the banks. I think that the genuine left response to this era of crisis is really not so complex. It's not so problematic as some people think that it is. Movements are defined by their demands. If they're not defined by their demands, then we're just talking about some kind of left of positioning. I'm going to put myself over here next to that group and hope that that will cause these other groups to join me because we're a little better than that other group. That's positioning. It's meaningless, but that's what we do most of the time. No, we must make a demand that goes to the heart of the actual situation, and this happens to be a demand that resonates with the vast majority of people. I didn't say that we should turn Goldman Sachs over to its workers as a cooperative, as I've heard some folks say. I think that is silly. Goldman Sachs and these other monster banks are instruments that have been crafted only for the purpose of the oppression of humankind. That is their one and only purpose. And you might just as well say that you'll solve the race to nuclear annihilation by turning the U.S. strategic triad over to the airmen and sailors and soldiers that man these weapon systems. That is silly and stupid as well. We want to nationalize the banks and put those banks to public purposes. And if that does not sound sexy enough, and it doesn't sound real sexy. If it doesn't sound sexy enough as a slogan, then we'll have to put the mighty meme makers like Rebel Diaz to the task of sexing and sloganizing it up, and I know that they can do it because it is a popular demand and they'll make it work. It is a demand that the Occupy movement never made back in 2011. They walked right up to the edge of the pool, but they did not dive in. I don't know why they didn't dive in, but they never did. The core group of Occupy did other silly things. They invited black Obamite preachers into the movement. I know when they did it, one of the central organizers called me up and said he was going to invite Reverend Ben Chavis to become part of the movement. I told him Reverend Ben Chavis wrote a column every week for a black newspaper, and the column was all about backing Obama, voting for the Democrats, and that's your mission, and that's all. But they went ahead and did it anyway. I have no idea why they did that. But much of the co-optation that occurred with the Occupy movement was self-inflicted. Of course, it was state-sponsored as well. Of course, we know that Obama himself directed the ultimate police crackdown, but there were contradictions at the core in the Occupy movement. But the greatest failing was not to jump into the pool. Nevertheless, they left us with a slogan that has popularized the common sentiment, the hatred of the damn banks that was common in 2011 and came to the fore when the 99% slogan was promulgated, and people should have jumped into the pool. But we've had time to ruminate and refine that 99%. It's had time to percolate among the masses now that it had a number to it, and they knew that they were somewhere in that number, and I guess that's a good thing. Well, it might as well be a good thing because we can't recoup that 7 years, but we can start right now by diving into the pool. It's not going to be easy to co-opt demands for the permanent nationalization of the banks. There's not much room for the Democratic Party to come into that and somehow get on the side of that kind of movement that's demanding the nationalization and dethronement of their masters, because the banking system, the Wall Street bankers are to the Democratic Party what big energy has historically been to the Republican Party. These are the pillars of these corporate parties. We will see what the relationship of forces really looks like. That is, the relationship of forces in society, not the relationship of organizations that call themselves left, but how people move in society when the demand is forcefully and effectively made abroad. We'll see what the relationship of forces really looks like in the United States when the left is pushing a demand that is truly popular on its face and truly transformative as well. The trick, the real hard part here, is in projecting what takes the place of the private bankers, the so-called Wall Street banks. It is absolutely crucial that the projected new banking configuration, the one that we say will come about in the future as a result of these demands, that new configuration be seen by the people as providing all of the services that the private bankers currently provide, and those services that they used to provide, and many of us remember, but no longer do. Because there will be great anxiety in the land when people think about where are we going to put our money now, the little that we have. And that transformed public banking system will have to be seen as part of the rebuilding of the nation. It is part of the rebuilding project, which is a transformational rebuilding project. And it must be seen that the new regime of development of the nation, that's the rebuilding project, will be a democratic one. And there is room there for all of the debate that we can possibly think we will have. What does a democratic society look like? That is the debate that follows, that flows from we're going to take over this banking system. And that redevelopment would have to be one that is in service of all the constituencies in the United States. And all of these constituencies, as I said before, hate the banks, and all of them do want transformation there in terms that they can understand. This is especially important to Black Americans. And Black Americans will be the most enthusiastic constituency about smashing the banks. Black Americans are the most left-leaning constituency in the United States. They are most in favor by every measurement of redistribution of income, and they are the most opposed to monopoly in the United States. The bankers and the real estate corporations are the ones who created the ghettos, and everybody knows that. Everybody in the ghetto knows it. And they are also the engines of gentrification, and everybody Black understands that as well. There is no need to demonize the bankers in Black America. But what you do have to show Black America is that this transformed institution is going to be not just of service to them, but that they will have a say in these transformed institutions. That in our language, that there will be a self-determinationist aspect to the reorganization of the banks in this country. If we are ever to see a real working unity between Blacks and Latinos on the ground, it will be in common opposition to the bankers who are behind gentrification. And gentrification is not just happening in a couple of selected places. Here in New York City, we know where the centers of gentrification are as it moves through the different places in the boroughs, and to a lesser extent across the river in New Jersey. But what I've found is that most folks who are under the hammer and threat of gentrification think that it is an isolated situation. They think that this is happening just particularly hard in St. Louis or in Atlanta or in Chicago. But in fact, it's happening everywhere. The banking class, if that's what you want to call them, is on the move with the same plan everywhere in the United States, inflating land assets through gentrification. And the growing Latino populations are moving into or getting moved out of the same neighborhoods as black people. And the commonality there is real, it is day to day, it cries out for collaboration. But I think that can be best achieved in a general movement to smash the banks. And we will see the kind of unity of action among Latinos and blacks that many of us have been wishing for, been frustrated about for a very long time. Several movements would be spawned by this demand for nationalization of the banks. In the last 2 years, it has become absolutely clear to masses of people that the concentrated capital in the Silicon Valley, and we're talking about Google and Facebook and Amazon and other corporations in that industry, is a danger to democracy. It is a danger to the people. It is a growing danger that people are beginning to recognize, and that's not going to go away. And so we need to be talking about what I think organically a demand for intervention in those monopolies who are politically so dangerous, will also grow out of a demand to nationalize the banks. And in fact, the list of struggles that would grow out of this central intervention is quite a long one, and there's no need for me to elaborate on it. In fact, it hurts my brain thinking about it. So we'll talk, and I think we'll have a chance to talk about these questions further in this panel. So power to the people.
So it's nice to be on a panel with three writers who I read and admire. That's got to be pretty rare. And I fully embrace, of course, everything both Paul and Glen said. And I want to just take about 10 minutes to focus on something that is unfortunately of great concern to all three of us, and that is a very well orchestrated and potent campaign of censorship against the kind of critique that Bruce and Glen and Paul and I make. It began with the appearance of a shadowy website called Prop or Not, Propaganda or Not, that, not surprisingly, Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, put on the front page of the Washington Post. It listed left-wing sites, including every site that I write for or that republishes my work, the same with Paul, and of course Black Agenda Report, as being agents of the Russian government. Truthdig, where I have a weekly column run by the great Bob Scheer out of Los Angeles, got lawyers to contact the Washington Post because these were anonymous. These threats were made anonymously. Nobody ever self-identified who was behind this site. We can all guess. And the Washington Post stonewalled refused to, although they said they knew who was behind Prop or Not, they refused to identify to us who those people were. They suggested that we contact Prop or Not to try and get ourselves off the list. Remember, these are all anonymous accusations, which I should emphasize are completely untrue. And we got nowhere. This was followed by the Director of National Intelligence report in January of a year ago, where 7 pages of that report attacked RT America, where I have a show. And it's worth pulling up and reading, because those 7 pages detail exactly why all of us and those of us who take this critique are being targeted. And that has nothing to do with Russia. It has to do, in the language of that report, the fact that on RT America and, of course, on these sites, we are giving voice to anti-fracking activists, Black Lives Matter. I just had John Kiriakou on my show, the security and surveillance state. And when Clapper went before the Congress in his hearing, I got a call from Ralph Nader, and he said, you'll probably read what he said, but don't read it, pull it up and watch it. Because when they start asking him about RT, it's not just the words that he uses, but the venom, the anger, the rage. And so, built around this idea of fake news, Russian agents, we saw a year ago, April, the imposition of algorithms by Google, Facebook, Twitter, that blocked what are called impressions. So for instance, if you typed in imperialism and Glen had written an article on imperialism, it might have been before that you would be directed to that article, no more. So for instance, in the site that I work for, Truthdig, we have a graph of referrals by impressions off of Google, and it has dropped from over 700,000 to below 200,000 as they perfect these algorithms. You've seen the World Socialist website, their traffic has dropped by 80%. Truthdig's traffic has dropped by, I forget, I know Alternet's 63%. I don't know, do you have a figure for Black Agenda Report?
We don't have an exact figure, but it's more than half.
More than half. But anyway, all of these sites are being targeted. Now, why? And I think you have to look at what's happening in concert. And as Glen correctly pointed out, there is a great deal of rage expressed towards a system, what Sheldon Willen calls inverted totalitarianism, what John Ralston Saul has identified as the corporate coup d'etat, that serves the interests of a tiny cabal, which is now being turbocharged under the Trump administration, with these kind of corporate kleptocrats looting, stealing, pillaging, as fast as they can on the way down. And so suddenly critics such as us, who have already been marginalized, pushed to the fringes of the internet, become dangerous because they really don't, the neoliberal advocates don't have a counter-argument. And so the counter-argument has to be shut down, which is, of course, what net neutrality, the abolition of net neutrality is about. It means that, we're already on the outer reaches of public discourse, but through net neutrality, they can essentially, by tiering the levels, the levels by which you can access sites, they can push us all into a black hole. And that's what's happening as we speak. And it's very frightening and very dangerous. I walked through the halls here and somebody came up and started going after me for being on RT. I didn't go on RT by choice. I went on RT because we don't have a functioning system of public broadcasting, where people who don't work for a corporation or the defense industry or are a former flack for some president should have a voice. But public broadcasting in this country has completely broken down. PBS is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Koch brothers. Have no credibility left. Their only response is silencing anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist critics, which is what all of us are enduring. As Paul correctly pointed out, the financial system of global speculation is completely unsustainable. I'm not an economist. I don't know when it's coming. But at a certain point, it's going to implode. And as Nomi Prinz points out, the difference between the next meltdown and the 2008 meltdown is that they have no plan B. They can't reduce interest rates to virtually zero because they've already introduced rates to virtually zero. They have built an entire economic system on what Marx called fictitious capital, i.e. the fiction that money makes money, that you don't have to manufacture or produce anything. So the kleptocrats get their tax cut, and what do they do with the money? They buy back their stock because it inflates the stock value to which their compensation packages are tied. They borrow tremendous amounts of money, and they don't actually invest it into the economy in a traditional way. They hoard it, or they use it to carry out punishing debt peonage on the rest of the population, because even though they borrowed it at 0% interest, it does have to be paid back. And so that is why if you are late on your credit card bill, it jumps to 28%. That is why even if you are fortunate enough to have health insurance, you are hit with this fee, that fee. That is why utility prices are through the roof, including the monopolies that we have, like Comcast. That is why students are being burdened with student loans, the largest personal debt in the country. But ultimately, it's not a sustainable system. And the danger, as many economists have pointed out, is that this time around, you are going to watch an attack or an assault by, in a multipolar world, China, Russia, the Middle East. We already saw, one of the reasons they're going after Iran is they no longer use the dollar as the reserve currency, by the way. And at a certain point, the propping up of the dollar by making it the reserve currency will collapse, and the economy in the United States will go into freefall. And if you want to know what happens economically when your currency is no longer the reserve currency, look at what happened in Britain in the 1950s when the pound sterling was removed as the reserve currency. Suddenly imports become extremely expensive. Nobody wants to buy treasury bonds. The borrowing that we carry out to maintain empire, we have expanded beyond our capacity to sustain empire. It falls in on itself with tremendous internal unrest, especially by a population that doesn't have access to information. that is able to explain to it what's happened. And that gives, of course, potency to demagogues. I think as Noam Chomsky correctly points out, don't be too excited about impeaching Trump because you're going to get Pence. And as Noam says, Pence is worse. And I spent 2 years, first of all, I'm a seminary graduate, although I went to Harvard Divinity School, which has probably produced more atheists than any other seminary in America. But I wrote a book on the Christian right. I spent 2 years with them. And when I say 2 years with them, I did it the way W.B. Du Bois did the Philadelphia Negro or Souls of Black Votes. I went and sat through entire weekend, pro-life weekends and creationist seminars. I took a seminar on evangelism explosion with D. James Kennedy. So I was in these mega churches all over the country. And the title of the book is called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. And I didn't use the word fascist lightly. In fact, I went to Fritz Stern, who wrote The Politics of Cultural Despair, grew up in Nazi Germany, to allow him over several hours to argue me out of the word. And then I went up to Paxton in Columbia, who wrote The Anatomy of Fascism, the scholar on Vichy, and did the same thing. And you can buy the book, so I won't go into a long discussion of it, but it functions as a fascist entity with a fusion of religious symbols with the iconography and language of nationalism, which is precisely what the German Christian Church did under the Nazis. And you have a white male megachurch, usually a millionaire, who is in direct touch with God. It replicates cults in that you have the feel-good service where you're all drawn in and everybody sings and loves you, and you have disciplers, and that's the public kind of Venus flytrap. And then you are sucked into the systems of indoctrination where you're severed from your family, all your recreation time, all your educational time, and Hannah Arendt writes exactly about this as an element. But the most important commonality with totalitarian system is the magical thinking. All totalitarian systems have magical thinking. And Trump has no ideology. He doesn't have enough of a brain to have an ideology. But into that vacuum, that ideological vacuum, we're already watching the Christian right. And should we get collapse without a rational, open debate, an open society, critics of the system are not going to have a voice. The only voice that's going to be amplified are the amplification of demagogues, racists, nativists, and Christian fascists. And what we must not forget about Christian fascism in this country is that it has an ideology, it has an educational infrastructure, it has a media infrastructure, it has an infrastructure in terms of building cadre. That's what Liberty University and the Oral Roberts University, where I'm happy to say my book on the Christian right is banned, and actually has underground copies. And so I warn you that what we're facing in the months, I don't know, nobody knows when this will happen, the bankers don't know, of course, is extremely dangerous, especially given the propensity for violence that runs as a dark undercurrent through American society. All of the forms of social control that have been visited on poor people of color, mass incarceration, militarized police that use indiscriminate lethal force and terror, collapse of a court system. Nobody in the inner city gets a trial. I teach in a prison. They all have to plea out. And actually the students I teach with the longest sentences are the ones who were fool enough to go to trial, usually the ones who did not commit what they were charged with. And they're given everything on their sheet. I taught a guy at Trenton, he had life plus 154 years, and he'd never committed a violent crime. So as Hannah Arendt writes in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the danger of a society that makes rights privileges, which is essentially what rights have become, means that in a moment of widespread social unrest, you have both the legal and the physical mechanism to impose that kind of tyranny, and tyranny is the right word for what poor people of color live under, on the rest of society. So I will close only by saying, and I can't reiterate it enough, that we have to be very conscious of the political system we live in. It is not a democracy. It is a failed democracy. Trump is not the disease. He is the symptom of the disease. Our institutions, our so-called democratic institutions, including, of course, the Democratic Party, which doesn't even really function as a political party in the traditional sense of a political party, have seized up and are utterly ineffectual. Every effort that we make to reform or attempt to work with these institutions is an utter and complete waste of energy and time. We have to look to South Africa as our model, and that means non-cooperation. We have to blow the entire system up. Otherwise, we are facing a species of very frightening corporate tyranny and ecocide. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon. Wow, this is a crowd here. All right, where to start? Thank you for being here. Thank you, my fellow Southsider, from Chicago, for inviting me here. And this is quite a bunch of folks to be with. This is something special. Before I start talking about what an authentic left looks like, I want to piggyback on some of what Chris said here, that at Black Agenda Report, at any website, if you run a website and you run a search bar on your website, your search bar is not powered by your own server, okay? If you ran a search bar powered by your own server, someone would be able to take you down. All they would have to do would be to write a script that does 10 searches a minute or 10 searches a second, and you wouldn't be able to deliver your content to anybody. So everybody who has a search bar uses Google, okay? Everybody. It's the only way to do it. And like Chris said, you used to be able to type Glen's name or my name and a phrase word for word in double quotes there, and it would turn up the article like that. And now, on our own search bar, on our own site, you can't find our stuff. That's how insidious this stuff is. So how many folks in this room don't use a smartphone? Oh, y'all ain't right. Don't use smartphones? Okay, well, everybody who doesn't use a smartphone, before you get out of here, okay, go visit Truthdig, go visit Black Agenda Report. I know that when you pull up Black Agenda Report on your smartphone, it's got a thing that says subscribe on the bottom there. And what that subscription is, that gets you a free weekly email newsletter. The deal is that, do you know what the internet marketers call email? They call it, anybody know? They call it dark social media. Why is it dark? It's dark social media because they can track it, but they can't make any money off of it. Google can restrict what comes up in a search, but they can't restrict what you email. They can't do it. They can't get in the way. They can actually track the fact when Truthdig or Black Agenda Report gets a reference from an email. When somebody clicks in an email, then they say, okay, that came from Yahoo email. But that's what they call organic reach. But we're dependent on you at this point. We can't depend on Google. We can't depend on Facebook. We can't depend on Twitter. We have to depend on you. Okay, you've got to subscribe to this stuff. You've got to subscribe to our free weekly email newsletter. I know Truthdig has got one, and I know some of the other outlets have got one. And then when you get it, you've got to promiscuously forward it to at least 50 of your closest friends and family members. And some of them, won't read it and might not even like you as much, but some of them will. And we're dependent on you. That's just real. It's the way it is. So, anyway, let's get to what we're supposed to be talking about here, and that's the vision of a 21st century authentic left. Well, there's a couple of things. First, I talk about what the bedrock principles of this 21st century authentic left would look like. Glen's made some references to it, and so has Paul. For one thing, a 21st century authentic left would make a bedrock principle out of independence from the two duopoly parties. You can't get it done inside the Democratic Party. You can't get it done inside the Republican Party. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to struggle for power. You may get some experience doing something that may be applicable and maybe not, but you're not going to fight for power there. Another bedrock principle of this 21st century authentic left would be, independence from corporate philanthropy. Right now, what most of us call the movement is owned and operated by its funders. Nonprofit organizations do wonderful work, some of them. Some of them do wonderful work. A lot of churches do great work, but if you're a pastor, an imam, or something like that, you've got to know. I mean, it's good to have the mayor as your friend. That's good, but if you're going to carry on the good work, then you got to worry about how you're going to carry on the good work next year. How you're going to keep the lights on if you criticize the mayor, if you disagree with the mayor. And so that's the trap. If you can't have a career, you cannot have a career in the nonprofit sector if you don't toe the line. It's gone for you. I live in Georgia, and in Georgia, the Democratic nominee for governor is a black woman with dreads named Stacey Abrams. Her first round of commercials were nothing more than, "Hey, look at me. I'm black, I got dreads, and I'm a candidate for governor. Ain't America wonderful? Ain't it?" And that was her first round of commercials. That lets you know where this is going. Okay? That's all you need. So, another core bedrock principle of a 21st century left, really of any left, has to be opposition to empire. Unconditional opposition to empire. Okay. That should be so obvious and so old. I mean, if you look at the history of the left, World War I ended 100 years ago, didn't it? 101 years ago. And didn't the First International, I think that's what it was called, break up? Or, no, the Second International, whatever it was. It broke up. It broke up because some of the socialist parties wanted to go with their national governments into World War I. So, I mean, that's a lesson people should have learned on the left 100 years ago. And yet and still now we've got outfits that are supposedly leftists. We got Bernie Sanders, for God's sake. What are the three biggest employers in Vermont? I think the third biggest employer in Vermont is Electric Boat, where they make the nuclear submarines. I mean, it's not located in Vermont. It's located in whatever state is next to Vermont, but it's the third biggest employer in the state. I mean, I live in a company town called Marietta, for Lockheed Marietta, where they build the F-35s. So you've got to have unconditional opposition to empire. The Green Party, which I've been part of for a minute, does get some of that stuff right, and they get a lot of it wrong too. Another thing that is a bedrock principle of how we'll have to conduct ourselves in a 21st century authentic left is we're going to have to learn some different manners and come up with some different traditions than what we have now. Everybody's on Facebook, right? But think about this. Many of us have learned our manners in meat space, physical space, meat space, from Facebook. What do you do when somebody disagrees with you on Facebook? Okay? You unfriend them. And but before you unfriend them, you call them some names. All right? You do a Twitter mic drop on them, and then you unfriend them, and then you unfriend 10 people who are his best friends, and then you block them. Oh no, but before you block them, you talk about them some more. You do another mic drop, call them some more names, and then you block them so that you never have to hear anything they write or speak about again. That's how it's done, right? But what we've done is and the end point of it is that you wind up talking to people, you wind up only talking to people who you agree with on everything. There's leftists I know who have blackballed other leftists because they disagree with them on 10% of stuff. But they agree on the other 90%. And so what we've done is we've carried that way of dealing out of the world of cyberspace and brought it into our everyday manners. So you've got revolutionary nationalists who only talk to other revolutionary nationalists. You've got DSA people who only talk to other DSA people. And that's, what kind of left is that? Where are people who are coming to political maturity going to even compare ideas alongside each other? Where's the tradition of debate and discussion where people can figure out what Glen is saying and what Chris is saying next to what somebody else, fill in the blank, is saying? Where is it? Those spaces where those comparisons take place don't exist. We have to figure out how to create some of them. Those traditions of debate and discussion don't exist. Right now, you pick a side like you pick a sports team. I was born on the south side of Chicago and White Sox, thank you. And we're working class folks, so we're against the north side yuppie friggin' Cubs. They're the enemy. We hate them worse than the Yankees. And we hate the Yankees pretty bad on the south side. But that's the way people are choosing their political sides. If we don't create spaces where we can actually talk about this stuff and where your stuff is side by side with somebody else's stuff and there's some kind of interchange. So these are among the characteristics. One more is a real authentic left, and I think Paul went there. A real authentic left is going to practice less intersectionality, whatever that is, and more solidarity. Intersectionality, there's people with different notions of what intersectionality is. There's some people who you ask them what intersectionality is, and they tell you something, and it's something, I agree with that, of course. And they say intersectionality is the participation of black women and the rest of this. Well, okay, all right. But it happens that the champions of intersectionality are the people who get TED Talks and the chairman of the Ford Foundation. And these people have a bigger megaphone than you do, if you're on the left. They have a way bigger megaphone than you do. And they want their stuff to be confused with the honest, authentic left. They need their stuff to be confused with the honest, authentic left. So when you use the same word that they're using, you're making their job a lot easier. But when you go to these anti-racism trainings, when they talk about intersectionality, what they do is they divide everybody into two classes. There's the folks who are struggling, who are the victims and victimized of racism, and then everybody else is an ally or potential allies. And why do the allies do what they do? Well, they do it because of their, I don't know, what the motivation for being an ally is. I can't figure it out, you know. But when you talk about solidarity, okay, the motivation for people acting in solidarity is their own self-interest. We got to be able to, I mean, 60 million people voted for Trump, right? More or less, 60 million. We got to be able to talk to 20 or 30 million of them. I mean, there's got to be a basis for doing that. And it can't be on the basis like Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, bless their hearts. It can't be on the basis that they are immoral, you know, and their policies are immoral, and their leaders are immoral. You know, it's got to be, if we're going to be able to appeal to some of them, it's got to be based on some of their class self-interest. If we can't figure out how to do that, then we're no better than Hillary Clinton when she called, what did she call the Trump supporters? A basket of deplorables. You know, and that's not a good look for her. It's not a good look for the left either, to go that way. So, anyway, those are some characteristics of the left. Now, where do I go beyond characteristics? Beyond the characteristics, there's three centers. I can see three centers of the left. One of them is you gotta have a party or parties, okay? What do we do when we don't have a party? Without a party, all you've got is activists. Who are activists responsible to? Who? Yeah, themselves, or maybe somebody in the nonprofit matrix. Maybe their board and their funders, or the board or funders of the organization that they belong to. You know, activists don't do socialism, they do activism. Is that a word? You know, okay. And you know, and you know, what parties do, I mean, parties do have done some bad things too. But the good thing that they do is they school us in mutual accountability. Changing the world is a team sport, baby. Okay? You're gonna have to build teams everywhere to do things. You can't do this alone. Nobody built this building alone. Nobody builds a road alone. Nobody built the car that you drove alone. It took thousands of hands. And you think changing the world is gonna be an individual sport for you activists? Come on, come on, come on, come on. I'm losing my place here. Okay, yeah, losing my place. Okay, yeah, we gotta have parties. There's a lady named Jody Dean who did a couple of books. One of them was called The Communist Horizon, and she's also written on what she calls communicative capitalism, which is a real in-depth explanation of how corporate social media perverts the way we engage in activism and teaches us bad manners and bad practices in everyday life. That I highly recommend that you just Google the lady, Jody, Jodi, Dean, and you know, you'll get. I got a real education out of it. You know, so another one of the three centers, apart from party, is prefigurative institutions. I believe Paul referred to Cooperation Jackson. Kali is somewhere in the building. I ran into him again right before this, but Cooperation Jackson is in Jackson, Mississippi, a city that's 80% black. It's the capital of Mississippi, and Mississippi is the poorest state in the union, you know. And the deal there is they're able to elect, they are the heirs, in a way, to the efforts of Chokwe Lumumba, and before that, the revolutionary nationalists of the Republic of New Africa from back in the 60s and 70s. And the deal is that at some point, they realized that they were able to elect, that their ability to win elections exceeded their ability to organize people for any other purpose, you know? And how do you close that gap? If you can win elections, but you don't have independent organizations on the ground, you know, that touch other parts of people's lives, what have you got? The way Kali explained it last October when we spent a couple of days in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, is he said that, well, we've done 6 elections and won 4 or 5 of them, and I still don't know what I came here to find out, and that's how many people actually support our core program, the Jackson Cush program of economic independence for this area, and what that looks like. He said, we've won elections, but we don't know who supports our program. And basically what happened is the Revolutionary Nationalists just became Democrats, and they left off all that radical stuff and just went door to door to get out the vote based on, hey, we're, you know who we are, and you know who loves us, and you know who hates us, and you know who loves you. So come on out. And that's all they had to do. That's all you got to do to win an election as a Democrat. You see? And I should have said that when I talked about parties too, is that building any kind of a revolutionary party, any kind of a leftist party outside the duopoly is 1,000 times harder than going into the Democratic Party and thinking you're going to do something. So when people look at the Green Party, which, is a hot mess, yeah, sure it is. Okay, it is a hot mess. And when people tell you that the Greens can't get out of their own way, yeah, they're right. Sure they are. But what the Greens are trying to do is 1,000 times harder than what Democrats are trying to do or what Republicans do. And there are no models for it, or not many models for it. So here we are. Prefigurative institutions. What they're doing in Jackson, Mississippi is they're organizing wherever they can cooperative economy. They're building land trusts. They're doing urban agriculture. And what they're doing is they're trying to bring into existence the prefigurative forms of the world we want to build. And we've got to do that. And a real, authentic 21st century left has got to figure out how to do some of that. We all say that it's not enough. It may be a good thing to try to contest elections, but if you're going to contest elections and not deal with people's economic realities on the ground, then you're just playing into the matrix that already exists. And so we've got to have both those things. We've got to have prefigurative institutions of all kinds, especially economic ones, and we've got to have parties. And then there's a third thing. Once we get those two things off the ground, then we'll have to do the third thing. And the third thing is we're going to have to go out and identify the strategic sectors of this economy and organize unions. Right now, union density is down to 6%, something like that. There's nothing, and that's bad. Okay, that's bad, but it's also good. It means that there's nothing but air and opportunity. Okay, between going out there and actually, there's a lot more besides air and opportunity. The Supreme Court just ruled that you can't sue. You can't collectively sue your employer anymore, that employers can make you sign away your right to sue your employer. There will soon be a decision in the Murphy Oil case, which it's Murphy Oil versus the NLRB, and the National Labor Relations Board has been neutered and whittled down little by little by little by little by little. And there's 1,000 exceptions to it already. And if the Murphy Oil case comes down the way we know it's going to come down, NLRB will be history, and it will essentially be a Dred Scott decision for labor, wherein no collective rights for anybody in a workplace will be officially recognized by any government agency. And it's open class warfare. So those are the three things that I see a 21st century authentic left having to do is we're going to have to come up with a party or parties so that we can have mutual responsibility and collective responsibility. We're going to have to do prefigurative institutions, and we're going to have to organize unions. And my notes are kind of disorganized here. There was one piece of that party stuff that I didn't cover. The parties are going to have to be systematic about how they do this stuff. And the prefigurative institutions are going to have to do this stuff. The Green Party, for instance, has been around for 20 years, 22 years. And can you believe they don't have an organizing manual? They don't. They don't have a standard set of procedures for how you organize a state party, a county party. You know, the way the law is, the first 5 or 6 people in the room, okay, in Georgia, in whatever state, can file the papers with the state and say, hey, we're a party, and then call up the Green Party and file papers with them and then say, hey, we're a party. But what happens if those first 5 people in the room are not leaders? What happens if they don't have followings of their own? If they can't put 10 people, if none of them, what happens if none of them can put a dozen people in a room on their own, and none of them knows how to do it? You see? And so what you've got in many states is you've got Green Parties composed of those first half dozen people in the room and maybe 10, 20 more of their friends, and no growth is possible. You see? When unions go into a workplace, when a union goes into a workplace, there'll be some folks who come into you who come, yeah, I'm all for the union. I'm all for that. But you don't make them the leaders necessarily. Because often the person who comes to you like that is isolated. Often the person who comes to you like that is not a person to whom the other workers in the workplace look up to for advice and counsel. You know, so you've got to find, so what union organizers are trained to look for is they're trained to identify organic leaders in the workplace and convert them and tap into existing social networks. You can find all this, or a lot of it, in, I don't know, William Z. Foster's 1936 organizing principles for the CIO and the Steelworkers Union back in the CPUSA days. So it ain't new knowledge, you see? It ain't new knowledge. People once knew how to do this, and some successful bottom-up unions still know how to do this, but these are among the characteristics of the kind of parties we have to build. You know, it's just a matter of taking a systematic approach to your task, as opposed to being loosey-goosey, the way a lot of leftists are, you know, where they say, well, you know, all of us can have an organization, and we don't need to collect dues. We can all just be volunteers. We don't need to hire staff. You know what happens? You know what happens if you allow, you know, if you try to have an organization and don't collect dues? What happens? Well, number one, you got no money to work with. Okay? You don't have a steady income. You might have a handful of activists who've got some money in their pockets and their hearts are right and their minds are right, and they'll give till it hurts, you know, and they'll burn themselves out. You know, you might have some, in Occupy, the folks who ended up being leaders were the people who could afford to sit in meetings all night. And if, you know,
Hey, let's just get a question.
oh, okay, all right, well, then I'll cut this. So, thank you.
I need whoever pinned the comment to pin the comment with the guests on it again,
What I'd like to
please.
do is take a couple. You get some hands up. I saw that hand. I saw that hand. And we'll see where we are in time, okay? You can address it to one person. You can address it to everybody. I think in answering, we can stay here, right? Is that right, sound guy? We can stay seated? We'll try. We'll see how that goes. This place is small enough. I don't think you need a mic. I saw you two first, so go ahead and ask it. Technically, we got to be out of here at 1:50. I know we'll run a little longer than that. So
Go ahead. You're first. You're second. Let me take a risk and say.
And they got to be quick too.
Yeah. No, agreeing with all the ills of capitalism, I still find that attacking capitalism becomes a question of hortatory presentations. We should do this. I don't see any approach to power. I happen to be involved in the election integrity movement. You can say what you want about elections, but there are ways. First of all, I see the problem as great corruption and criminality at high places and everywhere down the line. If we could correct a lot of this criminality and corruption in our legal system, in our political system, stolen elections, on and on and on. This is very practical and it addresses power, how to gain power. I don't see the the hortatory approach, telling us how to gain power.
All right, it's like, what you're doing is like appealing to Al Capone to restore law and order. The system itself is not reformable. It is a system that is utterly beholden to corporate money and corporate power. You can't hold office unless you're vetted, approved, and funded by corporations and will pass the legislation that their lobbyists write for you. Whether it's the Supreme Court, everybody talks about getting money out of politics. Well, we're all for getting money out of politics, but you're running off to Congress appealing to the very creations of the system to get money out of politics, which means that they'd be out of politics. It's like asking Schumer to get money out of politics. Schumer is the bag carrier from Wall Street to Democratic candidates across the country. So this is exactly, I think, I'm not going to...
Where do we go for power?
Where you have to pit power against power, which is what every single, Bruce and everyone else was talking about, which is we have to build our own organizations. I mean, there's a great scene in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, where it's 1971, there's tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators around the White House. Nixon has put empty city buses in a circle around the White House's barricades, and he looks out the window and he says to Kissinger, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. Well, that's where we want people in power to be. And let me just throw in something about what Bruce brought up. Why did they kill Fred Hampton? Because Fred Hampton was working with white racists in Chicago around common economic interests. And that scares the shit out of the power elites.
That's why they killed King.
Well, it's another, yeah. I mean, but I think that we can't stress enough that it is about, there's I forget the British expression. There's no permanent allies, only permanent power. I was out on Anderson, Indiana. All those guys, old UAW guys that they destroyed by NAFTA, they all voted for Sanders, and then they turned around and voted for Trump. So I just can't stress enough. I'm echoing what all these three guys said.
Yeah, I want to add, coast along on that and say I was really happy to hear Bruce Dixon mention William C. Foster's Steelworkers Organizing pamphlet of 1936. That's what leftists do. They build organizations issue by issue and build up from there. Now, I think it's distinctly possible, but for the rigging of the Democratic Party primaries in 2016, that Sanders might have gotten the nomination. And I furthermore think it's distinctly possible. It's complicated that Sanders could have bested Trump in the general election. I don't think Sanders could have done. I don't think Sanders could have done a whole hell of a lot in the absence of real organization from the bottom up. Lenin's pamphlet, 1902, and you don't have to be a Leninist to read it, is often misunderstood. It's titled, What is to be Done? There is no list of reform proposals. We on the left, we're always accused of being anti, we're not for anything. We're always accused of being antis. We're not for anything. We're negativists. We're nattering nabobs of negativity. We have a good reform agenda that we could sit here and talk about for 3 hours. Tax, financial transaction tax, green jobs. Cut the Pentagon. We got that. Alternative visions of an alternative society. We've got less of that, but if you look for it, you can find it. It's there. What would a post-capitalist society look like? Karl Perovitz writes about it. Mike Albert writes about it. There's a whole school of people that write about it. There's stuff in Marx himself, more than I thought. I had to go back and look at it a lot about what the reign of the Associated Producers would look like. Rick Wolf's stuff on self-managed workplaces and all that. What is to be done is about that. Do you know what is to be done is about? Has anybody read What is to be done recently? I know it's not 1902, it's not Tsarist Russia, and you don't have to be a Leninist. It's about building organizations, and that's what's lacking, and that's part of why I don't think Sanders could have done a whole lot. Capital doesn't rule just, the big money doesn't rule just through election funding. They would do all kinds of nasty shit if Bernie Sanders had got in. And then it might have been a disaster, which then the bourgeoisie would take him to be proof of, see, that's what happens when socialists get in office. It might have been a disaster in the absence of day-to-day real rank-and-file organization on the left. And I don't know. Did anyone else want to address that?
I have the briefest response to the gentleman. He is right when he says that screaming overthrow capitalism won't get you anywhere. But saying that we need to smash and take over the banks, that's an entirely different story.
Yes, sir. I guess we're going to take them one at a time. That's what you ask a question, we're going to answer.
I'm Rob Call. I publish Op-Ed News. It's another one of the sites that was attacked by Proper Knot, and that has been churched by Google. There's a quote that I really like from Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Now, we're dealing with a top-down linear system of power, and what has to be done to replacement is bottom-up, non-linear systems approaches. We have to replace the system. So we got to get rid of the banks that are existing, but we got to replace them, not take them over. I think the way to do that is public banking. It's 40% of the money in the world is public banking. It's just not happening here. And if we can create alternative systems and models, I think that's where the left needs to go. We need to create organizations, relationships, and we need to connect with each other in new ways that enable the power to emerge. And that's the way systems theory describes how change happens. And what's amazing about systems theory, which is the new scientific model that has replaced the Newtonian Cartesian model, is that it works for the stuff that they don't work with, like ecology and subatomic particle physics. And what's really exciting about it is the concept of emergence. Systems theory is based on loops and patterns and relationships rather than on parts and counting things.
Is that a question?
Do you have a question?
Talk about systems. Talk about replacing what we're doing.
I welcome what you just said. And of course, Ellen Brown has written extensively about public banking, and Michael Hudson talks about banking all the time, and all of us should educate ourselves on the subject. What is important, however, is that we not be projecting a public bank just a demonstration project, not just to show that public banks can work and serve some kind of purpose. That's not class warfare, and we are in a class war.
Yes, sir, right there.
Yes,
Next
this
question.
is a wonderful discussion, and I will ask my friends and look at this discussion over and over again. But shouldn't we have space to talk about those people who created the space for us to have this discussion and willing to defend it? Self-defense. We've heard about what may be coming down the
kind of matter. There's a wonderful interview that my comrade Kali Akuno did on Doug Henwood's radio show last week that you can find at leftbusinessobserver.com in the radio archives. And his position is basically in 30 seconds that you can have all the guns you want. You're not going to be able to defend yourself against the army and the cops. They get more practice than you do. Vigilantes and crazy people, but it's not going to help you overthrow a government like that. And we really have to be working towards the world where we disarm all the cops and all the militaries and do it that way. So that's the context in self-defense.
I got a question right over here.
Yeah, many of these concepts sound a little bit more who are still suffering from the Red Scare, when they don't realize they actually agree with some of these principles, but the way that they're presented is so controversial. You haven't characterized these ideas.
I don't accept that smashing the banks and dethroning the banker class is that controversial. I don't think it scares most people. I think most people agree with it. I think that is the rage that begs to be unleashed and channeled and made known.
Yeah,
I'd
I
say
mean,
go ahead, Chris.
yeah, I don't know how many people are aware of the Bernstein-Luxemburg controversy, but Luxemburg, I think, kind of took down Bernstein's position, which was accommodationist. It was accommodationist with a system that was as anti-democratic as the one that we live under and as militaristic as the one that we live under. And you may know her essay on Bernstein, but I think that when you live in a society, a capitalist democracy, where you still have institutions that can carry out reform. I come out of the press, so when I began 30 years ago, the press was a very different animal than it is now. I spent 15 years with the New York Times, and so I think that's Luxemburg's argument. The system can't be ameliorated, and I think that also applies for the day.
Yes, sir. No, you only got time for one. Look at the clock. You got time for one. It's got to be a quick one. Then we're going to go. One.
that most people think you go in debt in order to get an education.
Yes.
So if you want to gather steam for that, you left party, don't you think that you should do something about free education in this country? One thing is this one. The other one is about the gun control and what happens now in the high school. I noticed in this left four.
Looks like Ajamu Baraka just joined.
Totally, all of us are absent. Don't you think that at least there should be a panel concerning what goes on in the high schools and run by high school students?
Anyone want to tackle that?
Yes. 30 seconds.
You got 30 seconds.
Yeah, we don't have any control over, the left forum. People have to submit their ideas for these workshops, and probably no high school student wrote them or emailed them and said, let's do this. I'm sure they would have accommodated
There
such
were
people.
panels on both of those issues.
Okay, there you go. So,
There's a student panel here today anyway.
yeah.
And there's one on public education.
Oh, I'm sure there's more than one on public education.
Let me just say, 20 seconds. Ralph Pointer is correct in bringing up political prisoners. They should be brought up at every political gathering, because once we get a new and reinvigorated movement going again, we're going to have a lot more political prisoners. And if we haven't dealt with those who've been languishing for 40 and 50 years, we can't deal with the population of new ones that we're going to have, if we have any success at all.
Thank you, Glenn.
I want to thank everybody for coming out to this panel today. This is great. Final panelists, final round of applause. I'm hanging around here. Let's keep talking if you want to. I saw some people had questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in and out this weekend. I am going back to Pennsylvania later tonight. I'm in New York City for this. I will be coming back on about 4:15 for Ajamu Baraka is going to be on a panel, and I'll make sure that the information is posted for who it is, who's on the panel and what have you. So thank you guys so much for watching. I am at the Left Forum in NYC. And they've had a lot of great panels, Greens, DSA, no Dems. I like it. So anyway, I'll be back at 4:15 to 6:30. Thanks, guys.
I know all these guys.